I do believe that the issue of global warming has been politicized. I think that there are a substantial number of scientists who have manipulated data so that they will have dollars rolling into their projects, and I think we're seeing it almost weekly or even daily. Scientists who are coming forward and questioning the original idea that man-made global warming is what is causing the climate to change. Yes, our climate's changed. They've been changing for ever since the Earth was formed. But I do not buy into that a group of scientists who have, in some cases, found to be manipulating this information. And the cost to the country and to the world of implementing these anti-carbon programs is in the billions, if not trillions of dollars at the end of the day. And I don't think, from my perspective, that I want America to be engaged in spending that much money on still a scientific theory that has not been proven, and from my perspective, is more and more being put into question.
Hundreds of world leaders and climate change experts are descending on Copenhagen to try to come up with a new pact to slow global warming. And thousands of protesters across Europe today were trying to send them a message. It's time to stop talking and make a deal. But reaching that deal has now been complicated by what's being called ClimateGate, a string of hacked private emails between global climate change scientists in the U.S. and Europe, which have cast doubts on the very science this summit is based on. The emails seem to show that some of the world's top experts decided to exclude or manipulate some research that didn't help prove global warming exists. 1998 was the hottest year since record-keeping began, but the temperature went down the next year, and it's only spiked a couple of times since. An email from 1999 shows scientists worked hard to demonstrate an upward trend. They talk of using a trick to hide the decline in global temperatures. It worked like this. When temperature readings gathered from studying tree rings showed what looked like a decline in temperatures from the 1980s to the present, the scientists added in measurements taken later by more modern instruments, which gave them the answer they wanted. The scientists say the emails are being misinterpreted.
A lot of charges have been made that I think are quite unjustified, cherry-picking information and not taking it quite out of context and misrepresenting what it's actually saying.
Senator James Inhofe, a climate change skeptic, says the emails prove the global warming threat is exaggerated. He wants a congressional investigation.
We're relying upon that science for a bunch of stuff that we would be doing that would lose a lot of jobs and really affect Americans. I do believe that an investigation would show that they have clearly manipulated the data.
The official U.S. position hasn't changed, that climate change is real and needs to be addressed.
Climate change is happening. I don't think that's anything that is, quite frankly, among most people in dispute anymore.
Two major carbon producers, India and China, agree. They just announced they'll set goals to lower their carbon emissions. Though the U.S. Congress hasn't agreed on an American plan to lower emissions, President Obama's visit to Copenhagen at the end of the meeting instead of the beginning as originally planned is being taken as a positive sign.
As President Obama said, he will come to Copenhagen if a deal is feasible. And I have always said, and we have in the United Nations said, that while nothing is guaranteed, the world is ready for a deal.
But the leaked memos have given ammunition to critics of climate change. So climate change supporters fear Copenhagen may only produce the framework for an agreement that then will be passed on to next year. Jeff?
All right, Kimberly Dozier from our Washington Bureau tonight. Kimberly, thank you.
Carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is a cycle that is driven almost entirely by our sun, and has very little to do with human activity. The global elitists who are currently in power want people to believe that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere first is a tremendous problem, And secondly, they want us to believe that the cycle of the amount of carbon dioxide that happens to be in concentrations in our atmosphere is driven by human activity. And neither one of these things is true. First of all, carbon is part of the cycle of life and is necessary. Carbon dioxide in particular is very necessary for the health and well-being of things that we depend upon for life in symbiosis, the entire plant kingdom. Secondly, if you added all the human activity together and tried to account for how much carbon activity that was carbon concentration that was generating in our atmosphere, it would be negligible compared to the solar cycle. If you look at the solar cycle, which people who have studied ice core samples taken from Arctic and Antarctic regions, when you look at it, we see repeatedly that the solar cycle always drives the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That is the real science of this, as opposed to the pseudoscience that the globalists would have us believe.
From the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. Joining me now is Freeman Dyson. Mr. Dyson, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Man-made climate change. Where are we at from your perspective? Is it incontrovertible science, or are we being led down a path that you are suspicious of?
Well, first of all, there is man-made climate change. I mean, it's a question how much and is it good or bad? And there are all sorts of questions. The fact that it exists is not a question. Certainly there is some effect of humans on climate, and we have to try to find out what it is. All I would say is, first of all, we don't understand the details. It's probably much less than is generally claimed. And the most important thing is that there are huge non-climate effects of carbon dioxide which are overwhelmingly favorable, which are not taken into account. To me, that's the main issue, that the Earth is actually growing greener. This has been actually measured from satellites. The whole Earth is growing greener as a result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's increasing agricultural yields, it's increasing the forests, it's increasing all kinds of growth in the biological world. And that's more important and more certain than the effects on climate.
As we know, the IPCC is a political institution, not really a scientific one. So it uses the science for its own ends, which is why, for example, we've had cases of governments, Belgium, Germany, putting pressure on the IPCC to not to tone down the report, but to tweak it and make it sound scarier than the scientific reality justifies. This much quoted 95% figure is a classic example of this. It's a bit like getting people to say 95% certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, yes, the sun will rise tomorrow, but that's not really the subject that's being debated, is it? It's what the temperatures will be tomorrow. It's a sleight of hand. They're talking about 95% certainty that man influences climate. Well, I'm surprised they couldn't get 100% of scientists to agree on that one, because it's a given. The question is the degree to which man influences the climate, and whether actually we can this is anything we should worry about, and whether we should be bombing the global economy into the dark ages to try and stop it. All the computer models that the IPCC has used in its 25 years of existence, all of them have predicted, forecast, whatever, global warming much greater than has actually been observed. And this represents a problem, because what it means is that all these insistent claims that they've been making that we need to take urgent measures now to deal with this unprecedented problem, they seem to be based on junk science. The IPCC at the moment stands or falls on its computer models. There is no other evidence out there that global warming is any kind of problem. It exists only in the imaginations of the people who program those computer models and the scientists who contribute to those. The theory that anthropogenic CO2 is a problem. Well, what we see in this report is that the evidence suggests that the models aren't working, which suggests that the entire the entirety of AGW theory is flawed.
For the past somewhere between 15 and 20 years in the surface temperature record, there hasn't been an increase. So temperatures now are more or less where they were back in the late 1990s. This pause, or the hiatus, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change calls it, on its own it's not necessarily unusual, but the fact that it coincides with these predictions that we should have seen much higher increases in temperature, that's what makes it an important interval to study and understand. Not the pause, it's the flaws. What I mean is, what this is revealing is that there are some flaws in the models. One of the biggest candidates for explaining that, and probably the simplest, is just the models have built into them too much sensitivity to rising greenhouse gas levels. The reason they all predict there should have been so much warming is that there's been about a 15% increase in the CO2 level in the atmosphere over the past couple of decades. And if you put that into all the models, they all come back and say, well, you should have a lot of warming as a result of that. So if you have all the models saying that we should be observing something and then the data saying, no, actually we don't see any of it happening, you either have a lot of flaws in your data set, which I don't think is likely to happen given the agreement among all the different data sets on this, or you have some flaws in your models.
I think the public is obsessed with the phrase global warming, which is not the problem. I mean, the global warming, I think, is a very misleading phrase because there are other things which are much more important and easier to measure. For example, stratosphere cooling. And stratosphere cooling is much larger than global warming, because global warming is supposed to be a rise in the average ground temperature. The average ground temperature over the Earth is impossible to measure since most of the Earth is ocean. We don't have instruments. So this average ground temperature is a fiction. I mean, nobody knows what it is. There's no way you can measure it, and it's not particularly important anyway. I mean, what's important is how much rain is going to fall next year, how many hurricanes there are going to be, and how much ozone there's going to be. Well, the stratosphere cooling is something we really know a lot about, because that's easy to calculate. It's a direct effect of carbon dioxide, which cools the stratosphere just by radiation, independent of weather. And it's very large. So that's a measurable and known effect of the carbon dioxide, which can be extremely serious because it immediately affects the ozone. If you cool the stratosphere, you produce more ice crystals in the stratosphere, and that has a very destructive effect on the ozone.
We're here with Dr. Tim Ball, climatologist. We're going to get right into it. What is global warming? What's the theory behind it?
Well, the theory, and it's strictly a theory, and that's an important point, is that back in about the early 80s, somebody said, look, CO2 is a greenhouse gas that traps energy escaping to the sun, and if it increases in the atmosphere, the temperature will go up, and that it will increase because humans are producing CO2. And therefore, we're going to end up with runaway global warming, and that's where the whole thing began. It's dying right now. They've switched from global warming to climate change because the temperature is going down, but the CO2 continues to rise. And this is what Huxley called the great bane of science, a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact.
But one of the things they always say is they connect the term pollution to CO2, to carbon dioxide. It must be the most dangerous, poisonous gas in the atmosphere. How much of the atmosphere is it?
Well, that's a very good question. Of the greenhouse gases, which are a fraction of the total gases in the atmosphere, it's less than 4% of the greenhouse gases. And they're less than 0.1% of the total gases in the atmosphere. And then the human portion of that, of course, is actually immeasurably small. That is, that you can't distinguish the amount of human CO2 put up compared to natural. So, of course, the question that rises out of that, why the focus on CO2, which is not only a fraction of the greenhouse gases, but such a minuscule part of the total weather system out there. It's almost like taking you and picking one little mole on you and say, this represents you. That's what's going on here.
The belief now is that there's a scientific consensus. This is repeated over and over again, that man-made CO2 is causing the globe to warm.
Yeah, well, the word consensus, of course, started to come in with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here's 3,000 scientists, now down to 2,500. In fact, originally it was 6,000. Was that, well, here's a consensus. Consensus is a political word because consensus is important in politics, even if it doesn't necessarily represent the truth. It's what the politician has to deal with, is what the people think is the truth. Whereas in science, it doesn't work at all because consensus is not a scientific fact. And as Einstein said, you've only got to find one flaw in your scientific theory, the whole theory is gone. So consensus has been used once the whole climate change issue became political.
Back up a little bit, because the actual mandate of the UN's panel on climate change, what is their mandate? I think this is an important point to clarify.
It's a very, very important point, and it's an important point for all politics and understanding of how governments work. And it's through the terms of reference that the politician controls what's looked at. Now, you asked me about the IPCC. Morris Strong, who wrote the terms of reference for that agency, the first definition, or first of all, the definition of climate change was you only look at human causes. Ignore what nature's doing, which of course is ludicrous. And then one of the final terms of reference was, we're going to write a summary with a completely different group. The science side is science reports put aside. The summary goes out to the public. And then the summary goes back to the scientists with the instructions to make sure your summary or your science report agrees with our summary. So by controlling the terms of reference and the IPCC, this is how Strong controlled it.
This is important for people to understand. The only thing that the UN's panel on climate looks at are man-made causes, period, full stop.
Exactly.
They don't even have a mandate to look at the sun or other theories that come up.
No, the only way they mention them, and by the way, in the most recent report, 2007, two major changes in the sun that we know cause temperature change and climate change are not even mentioned. So, for example, and they can get away with it because most people don't understand even the fundamental science. So, for example, the orbit of the Earth around the sun is they're told it's elliptical, but in fact it's going from almost circular to full ellipse and back again. We've known that for 150 years. It's still not in their computer models. So, they got away with this by focusing only on the human causes, and that of course allows them then to focus on CO2. The most important greenhouse gas is water vapor, 95% by volume. Ignore it.
Ignore it completely.
Ignore it completely.